mocked by an arrogant town, and left with nothing but a scrap of paper. A desperate young woman spent her last coins on a cursed, frozen mountain shelf that everyone insisted was a worthless grave. They gleefully expected the lethal wilderness to swallow her whole. They had no idea she was about to unearth a perfectly preserved, long-lost pioneer camp concealing a chilling, decades-old cover-up. And they never suspected her staggering discovery would force their powerful elites to their knees and completely rewrite the valley's dark history. The stage from Bishop's Ford let her off at the edge of a rooted street just as the light went the color of old brass. Charlotte stepped down with her carpetbag in one hand and her father's coat folded over the other arm. And for a long moment, she only stood in the dust and looked up at the mountains. Timber Gap sat in a bowl of pines beneath a shoulder of granite, so tall it seemed to lean over the town like a man listening at a door. Wood smoke drifted low. A dog barked once behind a fence, and thought better of it. She had come a long way to stand in this street. 3 weeks by wagon and rail and stage, and before that, 6 months of quiet in her uncle's kitchen back in Missouri, sitting with the last of her family's papers spread across the oilcloth. Her mother had died in the spring, her father the winter before. Between them, they had left her a small stack of letters, a wedding deed-ripe, and one folded page in her mother's careful hand that named a caravan, a year, and a place. The Hollister Company, 1850, Timber Gap. Her mother's older sister had been in that company, a girl of 17 named Ada. She had gone up the mountain with her new husband and had not come down. For 40 years, the family had spoken of her only in the softest voices, as if her name were a cup that might break. Charlotte tightened her grip on the carpet bag and started up the plank walk toward the livery. The livery man was an older fellow with a white moustache and one milky eye, and he took her horse's board money without meeting her look. When she asked quietly whether he had known any of the Hollister Company, his hand stopped halfway to the peg where he hung the receipts. "That name," he said. "Been a long time." "Yes, sir." He hung the paper. He wiped his palms on his apron. "You'd do well to ask elsewhere, miss." Then softer, almost kind, or no at all. She thanked him and stepped back out into the brass light. A wind came off the shoulder of the mountain and pressed cold against her cheek, and Charlotte Carter, who had held her mother's hand while it went still, drew a long breath and did not shiver. She had come to find where Ada had spent her last winter. She had not come to be turned aside. The boarding house at the end of the street was run by a widow named Mrs. Pwitt, who took one long look at Charlotte in the doorway and set another plate at the table without a word. That night, Charlotte slept under a wool quilt that smelled of cedar, and she dreamed of a wagon wheel half buried in snow. In the morning, she walked to the land office to ask after the old trail up the gap. The clerk was a narrow man in a stiff collar who peered at her over his spectacles as though she had walked in trailing mud. When she named the Hollister Company, he laughed. It was a short, dry laugh. Not cruel exactly, but pleased with itself. "The Hollister ghosts," he said. "That's what you've come for." "I've come for a trail," Charlotte said. "There's no trail, miss. There's a shelf up there, past the second switchback, where some fools tried to win her over. Rotten timbers, snow half the year. The county deed, that whole claim off years back, for tax owed, and nobody's paid a nickel to look at it since. He tapped a ledger with a knuckle. In fact, if you have a mind to throw good money after dead men, I can sign it over to you this morning for the back taxes. 940 parlance. It's yours. He was smiling now. Behind him, another man in the office snorted into his coffee. Charlotte set her purse on the and counted out the coins. The clerk's smile faltered. He had not expected her to do it. He wrote out the deed slowly, as if hoping she would change her mind, and when he slid it across to her, the ink had barely dried. A shelf of frozen ground on the side of a mountain that nobody wanted. A cabin, or the memory of one. A grave field. Maybe 9,040. Miss, he said, and his voice had lost its laugh. There's nothing up there but wind. Then I've bought wind, Charlotte said, and folded the deed into the pocket over her heart. Outside, 3 men on the porch of the feed store had watched the whole thing through the window. One of them, broad-shouldered in a fine wool coat, leaned back and said loud enough to carry, "Some folks pay to bury themselves." The others laughed with him. Charlotte did not turn her head. She walked past them into the wind and toward the livery, where her horse was already saddled and waiting. Why does a young woman spend her last coins on a frozen shelf of mountain nobody has claimed in 40 years? What did her mother's sister carry up that trail in 1850 that a whole town has agreed to forget? And who among the men still living in Timber Gap knows exactly what waits under the snow? If a story like this is the kind you settle in for, take a moment to leave a comment and subscribe so the next one finds you when the lantern's lit. Because Charlotte Carter was about to ride up into country, the valley did not want her to see, and the first mile of that trail was already watching her come. Word of the deed traveled faster than she did. By the time Charlotte reached the livery, the boy holding her horse's bridle had already heard, and he looked at her the way children look at a person about to walk out onto thin river ice. She thanked him and swung the borrowed saddle straight, checked the girth twice, and tied her carpet bag behind the cantle with slow, practiced fingers. Her father had taught her to pack a horse the way a man packs for a war. He does not expect to win. She could feel the town watching from the plank walk, without turning to see it. 2 women stood in the doorway of the dry goods, arms folded across their aprons. One leaned to the other and murmured a word Charlotte could not hear, but did not need to. A boy on a stoop pointed at her with a piece of licorice and was quickly slapped on the wrist. A man leading a mule across the road pulled the animal wide of her, as though what she carried might catch. She heard the word ghosts twice before she had cleared the last hitching post. The broad-shouldered man in the fine wool coat came off the feed store porch as she passed. Up close, he smelled of bay rum and pipe tobacco, and his boots were too clean for a man who claimed the country. "Miss Carter," he said, and touched the brim of his hat, without meaning any respect by it. "Hollister's my name. Merritt Hollister. Believe you bought a piece of my grandfather's foolishness this morning." Charlotte held her reins and looked at him. "That shelf's been for sale 40 years, he said. You're the first fool poor enough to take it." He smiled with only the front of his mouth. "I'll buy it back off you for $1 when you come down. If you come down, I'll remember the offer," Charlotte said. "See that you do." He tipped his hat again and turned on his heel, and the 2 men still on the porch laughed the way men laugh when they are being watched by the one who pays them. Charlotte set her boot in the stirrup and rose into the saddle. The horse shifted under her, glad to be moving. At the last building before the road bent toward the timber, an old woman was sitting on a cane chair in a strip of sun. She wore a black shawl and a white kerchief tied under her chin, and her hands were folded on the head of a walking stick, worn smooth as bone. Charlotte had not seen her on the way in. She would not have missed her twice. The old woman lifted one finger from the stick as Charlotte drew even and made a small gesture that was not quite a wave and not quite a blessing. Charlotte drew rein. The old woman's eyes were the pale grey of river ice in April. She studied Charlotte's face for a long moment, and then she studied the horse, and then the folded coat lashed to the saddle behind her. "Child," she said, and her voice was dry and formal. The mountain kept them because someone down here needed them kept. "Mind which snow you turn over." Charlotte opened her mouth and closed it again. "Ma'am," she said, "I don't." "You will," the old woman said, "in your own time." She lowered her finger to the stick again and looked away toward the ridge, and Charlotte understood without being told that the audience was ended. She touched her heel to the horse's flank and rode on. When she looked back at the second bend of the road, the cane chair was empty and the sun had moved off the wall. The road climbed. That was the first thing to know about it. It climbed almost from the last fence post, angling up along a creek bed that ran shallow and stony between banks of alder. And within an hour, the town below was only a scatter of roofs and a threat of smoke against the tan of the valley floor. Charlotte let the horse pick his pace. He was a plain bay geeling named Moss, 7 years old, sold cheap in Bishop's Ford because he had a habit of standing still when other horses ran. She had liked him for it. He blew twice at the smell of pine and settled into the grade. The trail was not a trail so much as a memory of one. In places she could see the old ruts where wagon wheels had cut the ground 40 years back, filled now with duff and needles and the tracks of deer. In other places, the mountain had forgotten them entirely, and she had to ride by the lay of the land, the way the slope wanted to funnel a body upward, the notches in the rock where iron rims had scraped and left rust bloom on the granite. The second switchback came near dusk, a hard elbow of stone where the creek fell away in a white ribbon to the left. Above it, the timber thickened, and the air grew colder by a full coat. She smelled the shelf before she saw it. Old smoke, though nothing had burned there in a lifetime. Old iron, the faint mineral cold of a place where snow had lain deep and long year after year, until the ground itself remembered nothing else. Moss lifted his head and slowed of his own accord, and Charlotte let him. The shelf opened out of the timber the way a held breath opens into a room. It was wider than she had expected, 1/2 acre at least of level ground caught between the mountain shoulder and a drop into blue nothing. The last of the day laid a copper light along the crown of the ridge and left the shelf itself in a long blue shadow. At the far edge stood the cabin, or what had been a cabin. The roof had sagged along its ridgepole until the whole thing looked like a horse gone sway-backed in old age. The door hung on one hinge, and the door's wood was silvered by so many winters that it was closer to bone than to timber. Off to the north side of the clearing, she could make out the humped outlines of 2 other structures, collapsed almost to the ground, and beyond them the ribs of a wagon, grey as driftwood, tilted at the sky. Charlotte sat the horse a long time without dismounting. She had told herself on the way up that she would feel something when she arrived, and she was surprised to find she felt only the cold coming down out of the pines, and a great tired quiet, as though the shelf had been waiting for her, and was in no hurry now that she was here. She swung down at last, and led Moss slowly across the open ground. She did not go into the cabin that first night. Something in her declined it, the way a person declines to open a stranger's letter before knocking. She unsaddled Moss under the lee of a fallen wall, and rubbed him down with a handful of dry grass, and staked him where the last of the daylight kept a little warmth in the earth. She built a small fire against a slab of granite, and set water to boil in a tin cup, and ate a piece of bread and a piece of hard cheese out of her carpet bag. She wrapped herself in her father's coat over her wool shawl, and sat with her back to the granite, and watched the cabin across the clearing while the blue hour came down. The wind rose after full dark. It came off the higher slopes with a slow breathing sound, and it moved through the broken roof of the cabin and made a soft, hollow music there, as if the timbers were still trying to remember what a house sounded like when it was whole. Once near midnight, Moss lifted his head and pry-cricked his ears toward the collapsed wagon, and stood that way for a long minute before he let his head down again. Charlotte watched him and marked the direction and said nothing. She slept at last with the deed folded still against her breast, and she did not dream of a wagon wheel in snow that night. She dreamed of a woman she had never met, standing in a doorway with her hand held out, waiting for someone to come inside. Morning came thin and grey, with frost silvering the grass and a slow steam rising off Moss's back where the sun found him. Charlotte woke stiff along one hip and lay a moment looking up through the pines at a sky the colour of skimmed milk. She rose, banked the coals, warmed her hands, and walked at last to the cabin. The door hung on its one hinge, and did not so much open as lean aside when she pressed it. Inside, the air was colder than the air outside, and it smelled of long dust and the faint iron-sweet ghost of old smoke, a packed dirt floor, a stone hearth cracked down the middle by a winter freeze, a plank table on which someone had left a tin plate face down 40 years earlier, and never come back to turn it over. 2 bunks along the north wall, their rope webbing rotted through and hanging like grey hair. In one corner, a child's shoe, small enough to fit in her palm. Its leather curled hard as bark. Charlotte stood a long time in the doorway before she stepped in. She did not touch the plate. She did not touch the shoe. She walked once around the room with her hands at her sides, and looked at everything and let the cabin look back at her. It was on her second turn that she saw the beam. The ridgepole had sagged. That was plain from outside, but inside the sag went a different way than it should have. The pole itself was sound pine, dark with age, and it ran the length of the room as ridgepoles do. But where it met the west wall, it did not rest on the top log of the wall as its twin did on the east. It rested on a shorter beam, laid crosswise, notched in, and that crosswise beam was newer wood. Not new, not fresh, but newer by 10 years, maybe 15, than everything else in the cabin. The colour was wrong. The adze marks were finer. Someone had come back here after the caravan, after the winter, after the town had written the shelf off and set that beam in place. Charlotte stood beneath it and looked up for a long while. Then she looked at what the beam covered. Above it, where the roof boards met the ridge. A small square of the ceiling had been cut and fitted back. The seams were clean. The nails were square-headed and rusted, but their rust was younger than the rust on the rest of the roofing. She did not climb. She did not fetch a tool. She only stood beneath it and let the fact of it settle in her the way a stone settles in still water. Outside, Moss stamped once. Charlotte went out to him. She laid her hand along his neck and stood with him, and looked across the clearing at the tilted ribs of the wagon, and at the two collapsed structures beyond it, and at the low mounds she had not let herself count yet along the north edge of the shelf under the pines. There were 7 of them. She had counted them without meaning to as she walked to the cabin. 7 mounds, more or less even in size, more or less even in spacing, with stones set at their heads that had once been upright and were now leaning. She did not go to them yet. She went back to her fire, and she fed it, and she boiled more water, and she thought about the beam. That day, she did not act. She sat with the shelf. She let it be what it was. She walked its edges once slowly, marking where the drop began and where the timber closed in, marking the spring seep at the south end, where a thread of water still ran even now under a lace of ice. She learned the shape of the ground, the way her father had taught her to learn the shape of a horse before saddling it. By dusk, she had not touched a tool. She had only looked and listened, and the cabin had watched her look. That night, Moss again lifted his head toward the wagon near midnight and held it there. And this time, Charlotte marked the exact line of his ears against the stars. The next morning, she began to work. She started with the small, honest things, because she did not yet trust herself with the large ones. She cleared the hearth of 40 years of pack-rat layings, scoop by scoop, into a tin bucket, and carried the bucket to the edge of the drop, and tipped it into the wind. She swept the dirt floor with a bundle of pine boughs, tied at the butt with a strip of her petticoat. She lifted the tin plate from the table and set it upright, and beneath it she found a knot of dry beans, black as coal, that someone had left in a small pile as if measuring a supper. She did not throw the beans away. She put them in her apron pocket. She mended the door. She had no proper tools yet, only her knife and a length of soft wire from her carpet bag. But she wired the broken hinge back to its post, so the door hung true again. And when she pushed it, it groaned once, and then held solid. She cleared the smaller collapsed structure nearest the cabin, pulling the fallen roof timbers aside one at a time. It had been a lean-to for stock. In the packed floor, she found an iron horseshoe with 3 of its nails still in it, and a leather buckle green with time, and at the very back, where the roof had come down slowest, a wooden spoon carved with a shallow, careful cross on the handle. She set these 3 things on the plank table in the cabin, side by side, without knowing why. Moss followed her from task to task. He grazed where the sun warmed a patch of old grass, then lifted his head and walked to wherever she had settled and stood a few paces off with one hind foot cocked, watching. When she went into the cabin, he came to the doorway and put his head inside and blew once, long and soft. When she came out, he touched his muzzle to her shoulder, and she rested her cheek against the hollow above his eye for the length of a breath, and then went back to work. By the end of the 3rd day, she had the cabin swept, and the door hung, and the hearth clean, and a small stack of split kindling by the stone. Her hands were raw at the palms, and her back ached in a good, clean way. she had not felt since her father's last spring. She sat at the plank table in the dusk, with the horseshoe and the buckle and the spoon in front of her, and looked at them a long time. Her hands had learned something her mind had not yet said aloud. Someone had lived here after the winter. Someone had come back. Someone had wanted this place kept. Above her, the newer beam held its silence, and the small square in the ceiling waited. On the fourth morning, Charlotte took down the plank table and set it upright beneath the west wall. She stood on it with her knife in her teeth. The small square in the ceiling was no wider than a supper platter and no longer than a forearm. She pried at the seam nearest the wall with the point of her blade, and the wood gave a little, sighed, and lifted. Dust fell in a slow curtain onto her cheek. She turned her face aside and waited for the air to settle. Then she reached up into the dark hollow between the roof boards and the ridge. Her fingers found tin first, cold, ridged, flat on top, small enough to close her hand around. She brought it down into the light. It was an old tobacco tin, the paint worn to a memory of red, the lid held on by a wrap of waxed cord. She stepped down off the table and carried the tin to the doorway and sat on the sill with the sun crossing her lap. The cord unwound easily. Inside the tin were three things: a folded square of oiled paper, a short pencil worn to the length of her thumb, and a lock of dark hair tied with a strand of blue thread. Charlotte set the pencil and the hair on the sill and unfolded the paper on her knee. It was a single sheet, doubled twice, brittle at the creases. The handwriting was small and slanted, and had been made carefully in the way of a person who had time and cold fingers. She read the first line, and then she read it again. I am Ada Hollister. I am the last. Charlotte lowered the page to her lap and looked out across the shelf. Moss stood at the edge of the clearing with his ears forward. The wind moved once through the pines and did not move again. She lifted the page and read the rest slowly, one line at a time, letting each line settle before she went on. The letter said that the company had come up the shelf in October of 1850 with 7 wagons and 29 souls. That the snow had come 6 weeks early and had not gone. That by the 2nd month the flour was gone, and by the 3rd the oxen were gone. That they had buried the children first, because the children went first, and then the old, and then those who had eaten last, so that others might eat. It said that in March a man named Josiah Hollister, the captain of the company and her husband's father, had gone down alone to the valley for help, and had not returned. And that when the snow softened in April, a party from the valley had come up at last, and had found 6 alive out of 29. It said that of those 6, 3 had gone down the mountain, and 1 had stayed. It said that she had stayed because she was carrying a child, and because a child born of that winter would not be welcomed in the town below, and because a man who wore a fine coat had come up in May, and had offered her money to stay quiet, and money to go, and she had taken neither. It said that her son had been born in the cabin in June, and had been named for her father, and that she had lived on the shelf with him for 11 years before the fever took her, and that the boy had gone down the mountain, then to a family who took him in without asking whose he was. It said that she was writing this now because her hands were failing, and because someone someday would come who ought to know. It was signed in a smaller hand at the bottom, Ada, and beneath that a date, August the 9th, 1861. Charlotte sat on the sill a long time. The sun moved a hand's breadth along her lap. She folded the page along its old creases and put it back in the tin with the pencil and the lock of hair, and she set the tin on the plank table beside the horseshoe and the buckle and the spoon. Then she went out to Moss and put her arms around his neck and stood that way until her breathing came even again. The wind rose before sundown. It came off the higher slopes with the smell of iron in it, and by the time Charlotte had gathered wood for the night, the pines above the shelf were bending in long, slow arcs, and the sky over the ridge had gone the color of a bruise. She banked the fire in the hearth, brought Moss into the lean-to she had cleared, and wedged the mended door tight against the frame with a length of split pine. Snow began at dusk. By full dark it was falling in sheets that moved sideways across the clearing, and the cabin creaked once along the ridgepole and then held. Sometime past midnight, over the sound of the wind, Charlotte heard a horse. She thought first she had dreamed it. Then she heard it again, closer, a hoof striking stone at the top of the switchback. And then a man's voice, thin and cracked, calling out a word she could not make out. She pulled her father's coat around her and lit the lantern and pushed the door open into the storm. A grey horse stood at the edge of the clearing with its head down and its flanks trembling. A rider was slumped forward over the pommel with one hand knotted in the mane. Snow had crusted white along his hat brim and along the shoulders of his coat. Charlotte went out to him with the lantern held high. She took the bridle and led the horse across the clearing to the lee of the cabin, and she spoke to the rider in a low voice and told him to let go of the man. He lifted his head. It was Merritt Hollister. His lips were split, and there was rime in his beard, and his eyes did not fix on her at first. He tried to speak, and could not. Charlotte reached up and put her shoulder under his, and eased him down out of the saddle, and he came down heavily, and she took his weight, and half carried him through the doorway to the hearth. She laid him on her own blanket by the fire. She pulled off his wet gloves and his wet boots, and rubbed his hands between her own, until colour came back into them. She heated water in the tin cup, and held it to his mouth, and he drank in slow sips, with his eyes closed. Then she went out again into the storm, and brought his grey horse in beside Moss under the lean-to, and rubbed the ice out of its coat with dry grass, and covered it with her wool shawl. When she came back inside, Hollister was watching her from the hearth. His voice was hardly a voice. "Why?" he said. Charlotte knelt and put another stick on the fire. "Because someone did not," she said. He closed his eyes. The wind pressed on the door, and the door held. Charlotte sat with her back against the plank table, and the tin within reach of her hand, and she watched the man breathe, till the breathing evened, and outside the snow went on falling over the 7 leaning stones at the north edge of the shelf. The storm blew itself out before dawn. Charlotte woke to a pale, hard light on the packed snow of the clearing, and to Merritt Hollister sitting up against the hearthstones, with a cup of warm water in his hands, and his eyes red at the rims. He would not look at the tin on the table. He looked at his own boots by the fire, and at the smoke going straight up through the mended chimney, and at the door, still wedged against the frame. "I came up," he said at last, "to see if you had gone through." "Through what?" Charlotte asked. "The floor, the beam, any of it." Charlotte set a stick on the fire. "I went through the ceiling," she said. Merritt Hollister lowered his head. He sat that way a long time. Then he asked in the same broken voice if she would read the letter to him. Charlotte took the oiled page from the tin and read it aloud slowly from the first line to the last. And when she came to the man in the fine coat who had climbed the shelf in May, with money in both hands, Merritt Hollister put his palm flat against his eyes and kept it there. He did not speak again until she folded the paper and said it back. "My grandfather," he said. "He came down and told the valley they were all dead. He told it so long he believed it. My father inherited the coat and the story. I inherited the coat." "You are wearing it," Charlotte said. "I am wearing it." They went out together at mid-am morning. Charlotte showed him the 7 leaning stones under the pines, and the tilted ribs of the wagon, and the wooden spoon with its small, careful cross. Merritt Hollister knelt at the stones and cleared snow from one with his bare hand until his hand was red. He did not speak the names he did not know. He only stayed there on one knee until Charlotte touched his shoulder. They came down the mountain the next day together, leading the grey horse and Moss on foot through soft snow. Charlotte carrying the tin inside her father's coat over her heart in Timber Gap. Word ran before them again. The plank walk filled. The 2 women from the dry goods doorway came out without their aprons. The boy with the licorice stood on his stoop with his mouth open. Merritt Hollister did not raise his voice. He stopped in the middle of the rutted street and said loud enough to carry that the Hollister Company had not all died on the mountain, and that a woman named Ada had lived 11 years up there and borne a child, and that the shelf and its stones belonged to Miss Carter by more than deed. Then he took off his fine wool coat and folded it over his arm and stood in his shirt sleeves in the cold. A thin man in a stiff collar came down from the land office with his spectacles in his hand. He examined the tin and the letter at Mrs. Pwitt's table by the window and turned the oiled paper with the care of a man handling a christening gown. "It is her hand," he said quietly. "It matches the register of the company on file. Miss Carter, this is a true document. The claim is yours in law and in fact." He set the paper down as if setting down a sleeping child. "I am sorry for the laugh," he said. "I have carried that laugh for a week already." Charlotte only inclined her head. Outside, the liveryman with the milky eye lifted his hat to her as she passed and did not put it back on until she had turned to the corner. In the days that followed, others came. A gay-haired woman rode in from a homestead 2 valleys over, saying her husband had been the boy Ada sent down, and that he had died the winter before without ever knowing his mother's name. She held the lock of dark hair against her cheek and wept without sound. 2 brothers came down from a north claim, carrying an old ledger with the Hollister roll written in it, and set it in Charlotte's hands. A traveling preacher offered to ride up with them in spring and read words over the 7 stones. Merritt Hollister paid out of his own purse and without being asked for 7 fitted markers to be cut at the stonard, and asked Charlotte quietly what names she wished carved. She gave him Ada's first, and then the 6 she and the ledger together could recover, and left 1 blank for the ones they could not. The mocking at the feed store porch had stopped when Merritt Hollister walked past it now. The men there took off their hats. He took off his in return and kept walking. He did not ask for the shelf back for $1. He did not ask for it back at all. Mrs. Pwitt set another place at her table each night for a week and did not charge for it. The old woman in the cane chair was gone from the last building. The chair sat empty in a strip of sun, and no one, Charlotte asked, could quite say when she had left, or where, or whose grandmother she had been. Charlotte thought of the words about the snow, and understood them now, and did not press further. Spring came late, but it came. The preacher rode up with them in a slow line, and Merritt Hollister carried the fitted markers on a pack mule, and half of Timber Gap walked behind. On the shelf under a sky the colour of washed tin, the 7 stones were set upright with adahas at the head of the row. The preacher read the short words. Merritt Hollister stood in his shirt sleeves with his coat folded over his arm, and did not put it on. Charlotte laid the wooden spoon with its careful cross at the foot of Ada's marker, and left it there. That evening, when the others had gone down, and only Charlotte and Moss remained, she sat on the mended sill of the cabin doorway, with her father's coat around her shoulders, and watched the last golden light climb the ridge above the shelf. The pines held it. The 7 stones held it. The tilted wagon ribs shone for a moment, as if new. Moss came and set his muzzle against her shoulder, and blew out one long, soft breath. Charlotte spoke quietly, not to Moss and not to the mountain, but into the still air between them. "I did not buy a grave," she said. "I brought them home." She sat with him until the light went blue, and the first star came out over the ridge, and the shelf was quiet, and the quiet was no longer a keeping but a resting. "Thank you for staying to the end of this one, and for walking with Charlotte through the long snow to the place where a family finally got its name back. If this story of buried truth and quiet honor stayed with you, leave a kind word below. Tap the like and follow along for the next tale. A lantern in a boarded-up chapel, and the young widow who answered it.